What's up, everybody? This is Darren, head of remote at GitLab, and today I'm being joined by Gabe, also at GitLab, and we're going to talk about going slow to go fast in the context of documentation, handbook first, recording things to contextualize and operate in a remote setting. So first of all, Gabe, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Awesome. So look, I want to start out by talking about the importance of documentation and handbook first. So at GitLab, we try to live handbook first. Our handbook is publicly accessible to anyone. It's over 3,000 pages if you were to print it out. And it was not always 3,000 pages. It took a lot of diligence and intentionality from people over the years to build it and evolve it. It's a living, breathing tool. I'm sure somebody is making an iteration to it right now as we speak. It's vital. I feel like for us to have gotten to where we are, over 1,000 people, we need this documentation. We need this handbook to kind of be the North Star and a source of truth for the company. But I've heard that you have an experience that you'd like to share on the importance of it and kind of the pros and cons of doing it and living handbook first and not, with also some structure around coming from a co-located setting to a hybrid setting, transitioning to all remote. So wherever you want to go with it, go for it and we'll get started.
Sure. Yeah. At my previous company, we were definitely not as big as GitLab. We were only 35 or so people, but we had an office centrally located, but we were remote first, or attempted to be, in the sense of 2/3 of our team was distributed across the 4 time zones in the continental United States. And we kind of had that restriction just because of the nature of our clients and where we did business. Most of them are in the US, and so it made sense to have people work in the US across time zones. But the interesting thing is that as you start to grow and as you start to scale, how do you keep everybody in sync? Where if you have people in a centralized office, but then you have a bunch of people spread out, how do you share context appropriately? And I think that's where at one point, as we started to hire more and more remote people, we needed a way to try to keep everybody on the same page. And so we came up with the idea of like, hey, let's use, we didn't call it handbook at the time, but let's use a GitHub repo and let's use GitHub pages and let's like put everything in version control, in terms of process, policies, how we worked, how we operated, to codify it, to make sure that everybody could contribute to it. And it was really challenging. I think some of the more engineering heavy teams bought into it and really enjoyed that because they were familiar with the process of using Git, using version control. But the non-technical roles within the organization really struggled and didn't enjoy documenting things. And I think it kind of goes to different jobs require different skills and different talents. And for folks that are, doing sales and marketing, it's very relational. And it's hard to get them to slow down enough to document things. And we kind of found like without doing that, you lose context and you lose information. And we were never able to fully get everybody on board. And because we weren't able to get everybody on board, then it almost like felt rather meaningless, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. One thing that comes to mind when you mention that is there's an old saying that if you don't have time to do it right, when are you going to have time to do it over? And I kind of feel like that applies. So what held people up from documenting? Was the quote always that we don't have time, or we just aren't skilled in documenting? We aren't skilled in storytelling or contextualizing. I'm trying to figure out if it was like a communication barrier, something that could be taught, or if it was more of a mindset that I'm just not going to take time to do this in my day.
I think it was a combination of things. I think one, the approach that we took of how to do it using GitHub or using version control definitely was a barrier for the non-technical folks. They didn't know how to use Git. They didn't understand how to just how any of it worked. Even if we wrote up an instruction guide of how to do it entirely within like the UI of GitHub at the time. Sorry, GitLab wasn't big enough. We were using GitHub. Made a mistake there. But we even wrote up like documentation on how to do that for in a non-technical way using just the interface. And we had GIFs and we had everything. And so it's still like the feedback was like, that's too many steps. Like it's just too overwhelming. And I think it was too overwhelming for people to think that it was an approachable solution. And so a lot of people, would try to do things in Google Docs, but then discoverability kind of became a problem, and how things were organized. Nobody ended up keeping things up to date. And so we also tried a tool called Guru, which is kind of more card based, and you have like boards and cards, and then cards have owners, and they have to be re-verified every 3 months or so to make sure that the content can still be trusted. But people don't want to do that. It's almost like they don't think that it's valuable. I think that was the big thing. Like, making the time investment to learn how to do it didn't translate to return value over the long run. And I think that's the other side of it, is where a lot of people don't think in terms of systems, in terms of processes. Process can have a negative kind of connotation in a lot of organizations. Is like, it's too heavy. But the thing is you can't improve anything unless you have a documented starting point to improve from, right? So unless you're doing something consistently, you can't ever know what variable it is that you need to change to improve a given process. And for people that don't think like that, they're inherently not going to see the value in kind of doing handbook first type approaches.
Yeah, that makes sense. We have documentation in the handbook that actually outlines the concept of paying it forward by documenting. And one of the elements of that is, if you ask a question and someone on the team helps you discover a solution, and that question has not been documented and the answer has not been documented before this was agreed upon, then you take the step to actually document that solution, such that anyone that comes after you, or even currently on the team that has that same question, if they go search in the handbook, they then discover that solution. So without having to tap someone on the shoulder, without having to interrupt anyone else's day, they're able to just find and act upon that solution that was already documented. So in a situation like that, if you're ever on the receiving end of, oh, wow, I just discovered this solution that I was searching for and didn't have to ask anyone, it was the most efficient way ever to find this answer. My thought on that is, it encourages you and inspires you to want to pay it forward and give back, such that, hey, someone that I don't even know added this to the handbook and it benefited me. So in my day-to-day task, if I find a solution to something that hasn't been answered before, I'm going to try to document it such that I can help someone else. Is there a mechanism for kind of instilling that in people? Is that something you can screen for when you're recruiting and hiring? Is that a trait that someone has or doesn't have or can be taught? I'm just trying to figure out how that pay it forward mentality can be spread if it just doesn't come instinctually to someone.
Yeah, I think anything can be taught and anybody can learn anything. Humans are very intelligent beings and capable of doing more things than we even think we can do. And I think there are certain personality types that lend themselves naturally to thinking in that. And for those that aren't, you almost have to start from like the very top. It's a leadership standpoint of an organization. And I think what we've done at GitLab that's been really successful is, within our values, focusing on efficiency, and you asked the question, is it more efficient for not just you, but for the entire company if you were to stop and pay it forward, or stop and make it an update to the handbook? And that's where I think, in our values page, we talk a lot about global optimization over locally optimizing. So for me personally, it's slower for me to stop and do it. But what you don't realize is that by doing that, I'm probably saving, five times the amount of time down the road for everybody else, which is going to make the organization more efficient. And the only way that you can help people understand that is by making it a core value, like making like what is important for you in an organization and what to focus on is not getting your job done. It's making the organization more efficient. And you'll be like, and I think also getting feedback and like, as people on board and aren't comfortable doing that, like your feedback mechanisms into performance reviews and that sort of thing need to be geared towards optimizing those things too. So instead of rewarding somebody for doing great just at their one thing, look at how they helped improve the entire company, and look at how they thought about the big picture, because doing that will inevitably then, if everybody's doing that, it will make everybody be able to do their own job much more efficient too. So I think like focusing big and building reinforcing feedback loops into that in terms of how you praise people, how you reward people, is a great way that you can kind of instill that in kind of the culture.
That's a great point. I feel like things that get measured get done. And so if you measure someone's contributions to the handbook, which at GitLab we have contribution graphs where it's pretty easy to see what has been contributed to the handbook. if that is measured just like any other metric, then I feel like it will encourage people to do it. Or it signals from the top that it's important. It's as important as any other thing that is measured. Is it possible for a co-located company or even a hybrid remote company to implement something like that midstream? So if they don't have a handbook at all, if they were to stand one up using GitLab or something like Ask Almanac or Trainual, or you'd mentioned Guru, is it possible to sort of like midstream make that a core value? I guess that's part of the question. And the context behind that is we talk to companies who are either co-located or hybrid, and they want to transition completely out of the office and they want to go fully remote. And they'll ask us, how do we do that? What are the things that we need to stand up? What infrastructure do we need to have in place? What do we need to know about communication and culture to do this well? And inevitably, I'll say you need to focus on documentation. Documentation is everything when you're not in an office. People need to be able to go to a central repository and find as much information around policies and solutions as they possibly can to prevent complete chaos and a breakdown of communication. But then my next thought is, well, how do I encourage them to document if they didn't start documenting from the start? And of course, you can just start with one policy and then add the next policy and then add the next, and that's the spirit of iteration. But I feel like it needs to be instilled as a value before people will embrace it. Or do you just think it's outright impossible?
I don't think it's impossible. I think it has to be instilled as a value. I think it has to start there, and it has to start with the whole leadership team in an organization getting on board. So like in our case, I was over the product teams, and we had the sales and marketing side. And one of my business partners didn't necessarily see the value in it, and he was over the sales marketing side. So therefore, like, you have two leaders who don't fully agree on something, and because it's at the very top level, it trickles all the way down to the very bottom level. So I think instilling it as a value is really, really important. And I also think making sure that everyone who is in a leadership position in an organization understands the importance of it, not just like with lip service, but truly understands the value of it. Because if they truly understand the value of it, then they will emanate that down to all their direct reports, and they're on all the way down the stream. And then you have, like, from the very bottom, you have this value from the top that then connects everything together. So it's definitely possible. I would say for companies that want to transition from being co-located to fully remote, one really helpful step is to say, intermediaries be like, we're going to be remote first. So it's not fully remote, but it's remote first, which means you optimize everything in your office space to be remote first. So instead of optimizing big conference rooms, lots of tables, you have everybody sit in their own office and they wear headsets all day. Like, that's what we ended up doing, because a lot of people that were remote felt isolated and felt that we did things differently at the office that they didn't have experience with. And so we ended up putting cameras in every single room. People could jump in, they could live stream in any room. There was never a situation in which, like, we didn't optimize for the remote experience over the office experience. So I think that's one step. And then it's definitely possible to pick it up midstream. It just is a firm commitment, and it takes time, like lots of time and lots of energy. And the thing is, though, it's like going slow to go fast. Lots of energy up front, you go slow, but that accelerates things dramatically. A year down the road, whenever you have a bunch of people that are remote, everything's super efficient. Everybody's contributing to the handbook and to the documentation, keeping it updated. Information is very discoverable. It's easy to get context on things. And that's like, it's definitely possible.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I actually want to touch on something you had mentioned in your prior statement, which is if you take time to document something, you are benefiting. There's maybe a 5 or 10x multiplier of time saved across the organization for things down the road. But one thing I've also noticed is it actually is self-serving to some degree, because if you answer that question in the form of documentation, then you actually buy yourself more time and bandwidth down the road, because if you are asked that question, instead of having to re-elaborate and recontextualize, you can just answer it with a link. So if you can get people to understand that organizationally, then like everybody wants more time in their day. Everybody would rather spend more time with their family or outside of work. And by adhering to documentation, you actually can buy yourself a lot of time to do other things. So it helps organizationally, but it also helps personally. Is there a way that a company or a client or an applicant would know that a company is handbook first or lives by documentation from the outside looking in?
Yeah. So before I joined GitLab, I was interviewing a couple other companies, and the reason why I ended up wanting to go with GitLab is because I could learn everything I needed to know about the company before interviews, even to the point where I could go in and see what some of the executives were discussing about what to change and what they were worried about, what they were focusing on. So when it came time to like go to the interview process, and the interviewers would be like, hey, so what questions do you have about GitLab? I honestly had a hard time coming up with questions because I could answer everything myself, which made like the whole onboarding process a lot more efficient too, because I was already familiar with the company, familiar with the operations, with how things work, with who did what, with the org chart. Like none of that stuff had to be like explained to me in any way. And I think that's a good indicator is if you're looking at a company and you can find out everything you possibly need to know about that company without talking to anybody, that means that they're definitely documentation first, which can be a lot scary for certain companies. But like even within GitLab, hearing how we talk to financial analysts and things like that, like it's more or less all of our KPIs, everything is public, which also makes those interchanges more efficient because we can just say, hey, like here's all the things that we don't need to explain to you. It's all listed right here, and if you want more context, like we'll provide more context, but this is like the truth. And I would say like another good cue is if you ask questions and they're not in the handbook, then that's probably a pretty good indicator that you may not be handbook first too. Because a lot of times I get to the point where I can't ask a question that isn't in the handbook unless it's something like completely different that we haven't ever thought of before. So a good kind of going back to what you said before too, is like, how can you instill this in a company, that's maybe midstream, just make the decision to say like, if it's not in the handbook, it's not true. And that's something that resonates across the entire organization. It's like, well, you told me that it was this way, but the handbook says it's this way. So I'm going to go with the handbook. And if it needs to change, then you should change the handbook, because like that's the real source of truth, not like a contextual conversation that gets lost in the ether after it's over. So.
Yeah, I agree. GitLab thrives on having a single source of truth. And it is actually really liberating to work in a place where if there's any question, just go back to the handbook. And if it is decided amongst a team that the handbook is incorrect, then it's on the team to correct it and make it better. It's not that we aren't going to adhere to the handbook. It's just that we're going to make the iteration to the handbook to make it right. And it's funny you mentioned about, I can't think of a question that isn't already answered in the handbook. So I want to touch on one thing about onboarding, hiring, and recruiting. But we're actually in the process of doing a case study with a couple of universities. And it's been really funny to watch the interviews with the researchers, because they'll ask a question to someone at GitLab and essentially we will just regurgitate what's in the handbook. And so in the back of your mind, you're thinking, honestly, I could probably answer every question in this interview with a link to the handbook. But the utility in doing the interview is every so often they'll ask a question that actually isn't answered, or they'll ask it in a way where there's added context in the answer. But the funny thing about the loop is immediately after the call, the people that were on the call at GitLab then take it as an action item to go and update the handbook with whatever context that they added, such that if they were ever asked that again, now they actually could answer that with a link. So that's how we continually iterate and evolve the handbook. It's sort of a mission to always be able to answer with a link. And if we can't, we immediately fix it in the handbook such that going forward we could. On the recruiting front, I completely agree. I was speaking to someone recently about how beneficial it is for GitLab to have its strategy out in the open, its handbook out in the open. And we actually added a section in the jobs FAQ. So something very, very early on before you even apply, if you're just trying to figure out what it's like to work here. And actually the subhead is, what is it like to work at GitLab? And so we have a couple of key paragraphs there that kind of try to paint the overarching picture of the culture, and then 4 or 5 really, really useful links that I feel like if you read through those links, you have a pretty good understanding of what the day-to-day would be like. But it's shocking that so many companies don't offer that. And so when you're in an interview with a company that withholds culture and strategy until after you're hired, you inevitably get to this point in the interview where the person in the company asks, well, do you have any questions about the company? And this is an incredibly difficult situation to be in, because the truth is you have so many questions, but really you can only ask one or two. And then you're judged on what those one or two are. So then people on the interview side will say, they'll draw conclusions about you based on whatever the questions were. But it's really unfair, because honestly, that was just 2 or 3 of the like 1,000 that you have.
Yep.
So by putting all of that out there, you enable people to come into the interview process way more informed. I feel like it allows people to opt in and self-select into the GitLab culture and the way we work. If you read the handbook and it's appalling and you think there's no way I could ever work in that environment, it saves you the trouble. And so people that get down the interview funnel, they're there because they want to be, and they shouldn't be surprised. And when we get people in that actually are surprised, we immediately take action on that and try to figure out what was the gap in onboarding and how can we fill that so that no one else has that issue.
I think it also helps a lot from a recruiting standpoint too, in the interview selection process. Like I found it really interesting when I'm talking to candidates, and one of the questions that I ask sometimes is like, which of the GitLab values is your favorite? And sometimes they can't answer, which is a really good indicator to me that they actually haven't read the handbook. They haven't taken the time to consider what they're signing up for, which means they probably don't care that much. And I think that's a really nice filter too, just because like you're giving something to all of your prospective candidates to arm them and equip them to be successful in the organization. And if they don't want to take the time to do that, like it's kind of like a reverse self-selection, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. One thing that I found interesting is we care so much about the values. Values are the North Star of every decision that's made here, but it's unlike any place I've ever worked before in that the values actually mean something and they aren't modified based on the manager and that interpretation of it. And one of the things that I think about all the time is how do I get people to come into GitLab and truly give themselves permission to drop any prior organizational baggage and give themselves permission to operate differently, to truly live by the values and trust that the values here are more than writing on a wall. Because maybe the last 20 years of their career experience would tell them, oh, values are just something that leadership put out there eons ago, but it doesn't actually drive day-to-day decisions. And so that's something I think about all the time. Like I want people to read the values and understand the values before they apply. But more than that, I actually want them to believe that they matter, even if their past experience would say that most values at most companies don't actually matter that much.
Yeah, it takes time. You can get really hurt by an organization. I mean, you devote like 8 hours a day for years of your life into growing something and participating in a community, and you can get burned really easily. And I think that's where it takes time to build trust. And the fastest way to do that is seeing that lived out by the leadership within the organization. So, reinforcing the values, lifting them up, and upholding them in all sorts of different ways. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we face at GitLab as we grow and scale, is like, how do we do that when we have such a huge influx of new people? And how do we help them trust us as quickly as possible and trust the values as quickly as possible so that they can heal from some of their baggage at past organizations? It's a real challenge, and I'm not sure the best way to solve it or how to accelerate it, but it's something I'm interested in exploring because I totally agree with you.
Yeah, I hear you. We're working on the onboarding issue and trying to surface as early as possible just the importance of values and how much it actually means, such that hopefully it's impossible to miss when you're onboarding. But onboarding is daunting anywhere. We have many tasks in our onboarding issue. And yeah, we've got to figure out great ways to reinforce that even beyond onboarding. I feel like GitLab Contribute is a great sort of line in the sand moment to reinforce what that is. And then of course in our thanks channel and day-to-day, but you can never really reinforce it enough because your day-to-day workload can kind of throw curveballs left and right, where it's really easy to just default to whatever your default is instead of go back to those values. But if anybody listening has great advice on that, we have values pages in the handbook. Send us an MR, send us a comment in the YouTube description. We love contributions. This isn't just GitLab doing this thing. We're trying to rally around all of the companies that want to see this improve. So cool, man. This has been awesome. Any last thoughts before I let you go?
No, it's been a pleasure. If you want to talk about this stuff anymore, I'm happy to do it. I love talking handbook. I love talking values and organizational theories, right up my alley. So appreciate it.
Perfect. Likewise. Well, to all the viewers out there, I'm going to put links in the YouTube description of the handbook pages that we've talked about, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.